Look, so this video is 100% going to get me labeled as a Putin apologist or a Russian agent. But it's got to be said that the United States and NATO are directly responsible for Russia invading Ukraine. Like, sure, Russia bears responsibility, but like 90% of the blame is on the US and NATO. And look, I'm not basing that on my opinion. I have no love for Russia, but it's a verifiable historical fact that the vast majority of this falls at the feet of NATO and the United States. Now, before y'all fucking lose your shit in my comments, let me explain. Let's talk about the history of it. So in 1990, there was a famous meeting between James Baker, who was the US Secretary of State, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in charge of Russia. And in that meeting, which we have the fucking transcripts for, Russia agreed to support German unification, and the United States and NATO agreed to no more eastern expansion of NATO. The actual wording was, we will not move 1 inch towards Russia. Gorbachev agreed. They signed a treaty, and that was that. Then, just 4 years later in 1994, Bill Clinton broke that treaty and signed off on a deal that would allow NATO to expand all the way to Ukraine, which is on the Russian border. Now, that plan actually went into effect in 1999 when NATO added Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Now, when that happened, Russia could have flipped the fuck out. It could have started a military conflict over it, but they actually let it slide because none of those countries directly border them. Now, later in 1999, the US led the bombing of Serbia. Now, a lot of you are probably too young to remember how fucking bad that was. And it was bad. It was basically the United States and NATO bombing Belgrade for 78 days in a row, all with the express intention of breaking up that country, which was a Russian ally. And again, even though a direct ally of Russia was attacked and had their country completely fucking torn apart, they didn't respond. Putin took power, let it slide in the interest of maintaining world peace. And the wild thing is, his only actual response was to open negotiations for Russia to join NATO, which was flatly rejected by the United States. And even after the United States completely rejected them, in 2001, when we invaded Afghanistan, Russia supported us. They openly supported us in our fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Then a year later, the United States pulls out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We followed this up by deploying missile systems in every NATO country and made sure that the missiles that we installed were capable of reaching Russia. Like, that's a direct threat. And if you disagree and think that's not a direct threat, go ahead and dial the time machine back to 1962, when Russia wanted to put missile systems in an allied sovereign country that had the capability of reaching the United States. It's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the United States was willing to start another world fucking war to stop that from happening. Now, what did Russia do in response to this? They asked for sanctions. They petitioned the UN to sanction the United States. They didn't attack, they didn't invade, they didn't do anything but asked for sanctions. Then in 2004, the United States continued its expansion towards Russia by adding Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Lithuania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, all in violation of our treaty. Then in 2005, the United States decided to execute a regime change in Ukraine, which again, let me remind you, directly borders Russia. Now, thankfully for world peace, Yanukovych was elected in 2009 on the basis of neutrality. His whole platform was that Ukraine does not join NATO, it doesn't join Russia, it remains a neutral state. And then 5 years later, the United States openly and directly participates in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Like, we didn't even hide that we were doing it. We directly and openly overthrew a government that wanted to remain neutral. And we know we did it for a fact because Russia actually intercepted the phone call where American agents and the American diplomats were discussing who we were going to remove and who we were going to put in power. They broadcasted it worldwide to embarrass the United States. But do you know what Russia did in response to that? Fucking nothing, besides ask the United Nations for sanctions. No attacks, no invasions, just sanctions. Then, after all of that happened, in December 2021, Putin actually proposed a Russian-United States security agreement, where the only thing he requested was no further NATO expansion eastwards towards Russia. That was the only fucking thing he wanted. And he was willing to sign a security agreement with the United States saying he would support us. And the only thing he wanted was something the United States and NATO were already under treaty not to do. Well, we flatly rejected that. The Biden administration didn't even engage in negotiations over it. They basically just said, fuck no. So basically what you have leading up to the invasion of Ukraine is the United States and NATO for more than 30 years, violating their own treaty and doing exactly what we promised not to do. Over and over again, NATO and the United States kept expanding towards Russia. And Russia, over and over again, lets it slide for more than 30 fucking years. Then the tipping point was when the United States installed their little puppet government in Ukraine. Russia invades Ukraine, and magically, Russia is the only bad guy in all of this? You can't expect to be able to violate treaties for 30 years, deploy missile systems into every country surrounding Russia, and then when you're about to do it again in a country directly bordering them, a country where half the citizens are ethnically Russian, and expect Russia to do nothing. By the way, 5 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Zelensky in Ukraine tried to agree to neutrality, an action that would have ended the conflict right there. But the US and NATO forced Ukraine not to agree to that. And here we are with close to 1 million dead Ukrainians, all for a conflict that could have ended after 5 days. So is Russia the bad guy? Sure, don't invade sovereign nations. But you know what the US and NATO shouldn't have been doing? Violating treaties for 3 decades. Expanding our military alliance closer and closer and closer to Russia's border. Putting missile systems in all of those countries, making sure they have the capability of reaching the Russian capital, all while executing regime change in many of these nations to puppet governments that the United States controls. The US and NATO shouldn't be bombing Russian allies for 78 days and completely destroying their country. And here's the thing, if the US and NATO are going to do all that, that's fine. That's how shit works in the world. But the United States and NATO, we sure as fuck don't get to call ourselves the good guys.